Easter Sunday, 1944. The Scottish winter of 1944 solidified to steel before it began to unfreeze in late March. Burns Night was marked, though Bill Sterling proclaimed Robbie Burns to be a lowlander. But it was an excuse to eat haggis and drink whiskey, so of course, that was all that was needed. Shrove Tuesday passed into Ash Wednesday, and a symbolic gesture of burning flour and fat was carried out in the chapel for, as Paddy had said to Bill Sterling when he had condemned all the sugar, "Don't you know there's a war on?" It was Good Friday when Josephine was sitting at the dining room table, propped up with a cushion at the small of her back. The silk parachute thread had been taken out by Dr. Clarkson, who had proclaimed he had never seen a neater seam and had marvelled at the incision, being hip to hip rather than lateral, and had warned Paddy, standing as they were in the corridor on the first floor, about her becoming with child again. Paddy had asked whether she would ever be a mother, to which Clarkson had described how risky it would be. Josephine turned then, half relieved, for she never wanted a child to be in the position she had been, left with some relative and brought up by whim, for she had nothing with which to provide a home. Chastity, then, extremely easy. She was glad now the bleeding had stopped, and that Paddy had allowed her out with the men on light training, much to the protective chagrin of Bill Sterling. "She is my responsibility, Paddy," he had protested, to which Paddy Mayne had replied, "My sister, so I will decide." Josephine felt like telling them both that she would decide, but Bill had not exactly conceded, rather, told her she was to check in with him daily so he could monitor her health in case Dudley Clark asked. "You are in his sphere of work, Josephine, and Hugh Dalton's. Earn some money," Josephine told herself, "get yourself away. You will be under no one's responsibility, no one's fear." A light supper was produced to mark the day of the Saviour's crucifixion, with a promise of a celebratory feast, likely to include grouse, for the staff had been stripping feathers off the birds for a week, and Bill Sterling was encouraging the SAS men to join him. "Should anyone wish to be baptized, or indeed confirmed on Easter Sunday, I can arrange Father McNeil to speak to you." A bloody recruitment drive, Paddy muttered, but said no more as they ate the salmon that Bill had somehow procured. The vegetables grown on the estate were also delicious, Josephine considered, and she knew Bill had sent a good deal to the surrounding villages to supplement their rations. "Did you know that the church in this country split over the celebration of Easter?" Bill told them, as they ate. Far back in time, to when the Saxons in Northumbria still followed the Celtic Church, and King Oswiu married a woman who followed the Roman Church. "That wasn't the first split," Josephine replied, shaking her head as more salmon was passed around. "When Comsil came to Iona, which is where Oswald and Oswiu went to flee their cousin, there was already a Christian tradition from the Welsh that there was no Celtic church, as such. More like how the nonconformists are broken bar Methodists, Unitarians, Trinitarians, Baptists are Christian." She smiled as some of the nodded, as she mentioned their own faiths. "You know a lot about it," Bill Sterling replied. "I know a lot about Ireland." She remembered sneaking into a Sunday school with other children from the village, a vicar telling the children such stories, about Comsil braving the Northern Sea to take Christianity to Scotland, a broken bar brave St. Brendan meeting sea creatures and icy lands and mountains of fire, a broken bar St. Bridget and her cloak. These were people of Ireland, not of the church, not of a sectarian struggle. These people lived in land she had lived. And for the Roman Church to claim the country wholesale was, to Josephine, as wrong as the British claiming the land too. "No one can take away from you what you've learned." Following the doctor's grim prognosis, that Josephine would live but the child, so underdeveloped, could not, Bill had found himself standing in the doorway of her room in the early weeks, feeling he could do nothing but watch over her as she slept. He wanted to apologize for the path David had carved through her life. Instead, the Red Cross parcels had been the right decision. "The Prisoners' Leisure Hours Fund needs you today, Ethan," Bill had said, his voice strained with an unspoken plea for forgiveness. David was his brother, yet, as always, he felt responsible for his actions, particularly when the consequence had been so raw, so brutal, so personal, that Josephine had accepted the relegation with a terrifying, silent compliance was positive, but Bill still felt uncomfortable. Less so, when he saw her put her efforts into the months leading into the spring, leaning carefully over a table in her room, her fingers raw from twine and cardboard, pleased when none came back from the quality assurance that was Henry Druce's strict measure of acceptability. By Easter, she had become the mistress of the loaded parcel, overseeing a clandestine assembly line of hope and sabotage, delighted with the deceptions such as Q devices, dagger pens, garrote wires, keys that unscrewed adapted Swiss Army knives behind the 4 ounces packets of tea and tins of Klim's skill maps sandwiched between the base and top layer of Monopoly boards, within the laminate secret compasses in replacement buttons and within shaving brushes, all nestled up with legitimate gifts like Cadbury's fruit and nut bars and Players cigarettes. The hope of a January dash to Colditz had died, despite Paddy Mayne's vociferous advocacy by a single, blunt directive from London. Stuart Menzies, the head of SAS, had been categorical: there would be no rogue rescue missions for David Sterling. The reason so existed was to cause chaos and sabotage, and to risk a diplomatic or military disaster on a prison break for one individual, however prominent, while the fate of Europe hung on the Normandy landings was, in Menzies' view, unthinkable. Bill Sterling had received the news with despondency and, even further, he knew he had to tell Paddy Mayne where the SAS was going. "You're being dropped 30 miles inland from the coast, Paddy," Bill said, his voice level despite the storm brewing in the other man's eyes. "SAS front action. Your job is to sow absolute chaos behind the lines. Sever the arteries of the Wehrmacht before the boys hit the beaches. That is your mission." Colditz is off the board. Paddy's knuckles whitened as he gripped a cleaning rod. The fury in him was no longer explosive, it had become a concentrated, pressurized thing. He wasn't being sent to find his commander or to confront the man who had wronged his sister. He was being sent to be the tip of a spear he no longer fully believed in. "She'll not be happy, Josephine," Paddy told Bill, whose face told the Irishman that was a given. "And Galitzine? They are so, and that's up to Hugh Dalton," which meant that they were disaggregated, and once dropped, could do anything their fertile minds could conceive, with the objective of maximum sabotage and chaos and destruction. Which meant, Galitzine, Barkworth, Franks and Druce could do whatever they wanted. 88,888,888. The air in the Bendelustrous building was thick with the scent of floor wax and the looming shadow of the gallows. Klaus von Stauffenberg sat behind his desk, his one good eye fixed on Eve Mansoura with a clinical, detached coldness. He knew exactly who she was, the woman who had scorched the SO networks in the Vosges with the flick of a cigarette. The deaths of Natzweiler and Gagino, of these brave men, the Maquis of the Musi, the men and women too subjected to a Selhorst were, to this woman, merely a necessary currency. She had betrayed their radio signatures to the Seekostenst, not out of a love for the Reich, but because the British were an obstacle to a free, armed Algeria. To her, the Nazis were simply the world's most efficient arms dealers. Stauffenberg leaned back, his empty sleeve pinned neatly. He knew, through the Ablaze back channels, that Dudley Clark had let her go from London. He also knew why. Clark was a man who didn't throw away a broken tool, he let it rust in the enemy's garden to see what it infected. Stauffenberg, already deep into the planning of Valkyrie, had no intention of telling Eve he knew she was a gift from the British. He wanted to see how far she would crawl into the Nazi hierarchy before the trap snapped shut. "You are a remarkably dangerous creature, Mademoiselle Mansoura," Stauffenberg said, his voice low. "You come to Berlin while the world burns, looking for a bargain. Why should I trust a woman who burned her own nest in France?" Eve didn't flinch. She leaned over his map, her finger tracing the Mediterranean coastline. "I didn't burn it, Colonel. I cleared the brush. The British are an infection in North Africa, as are the French. I want the antidote, and I see it before me. A hammer. One heavy enough to smash the French colonizers." "Come," von Stauffenberg encouraged, offering her brandy. "There needs to be more from you, To be clear, if you wish the Führer to sanction assistance to the Algerians. He gestured towards the brandy glass. Carefully, gracefully, Eve put out a slim arm and took hold of the spirit. She rubbed her neck, absently. Perhaps behind half-hanged was worse than being executed in its entirety. The Abwehr wish you to return to the Mediterranean, von Stauffenberg continued, taking his own brandy glass and taking a delicate sip. Use your remaining contacts, those who still trust you, to feed the British false intelligence about a German counteroffensive in Tunisia. This will keep Allied divisions tied down in the deserts and away from the Atlantic Wall. He leaned forward, waiting for the bite. He did not have long to wait. In exchange, Eve picked up the dialogue. I demand a shipment, 20,000 carabiner 98K rifles and 2 million rounds of ammunition, diverted from the Italian front and moved via U-boat to hidden caches in the Ore-Tilde-Diaris mountains. You would let the world choke on its own blood if Algiers stood alone at the end of it, Stauffenberg remarked, his gaze boring into her. I am a realist, Colonel, Eve replied, her smile sharp and devoid of warmth. The British taught me how to betray. I am simply applying the lesson. You give me the guns to kill the French and British in Africa, and I will give you the rest of the swallows still nesting in the Vosges. I'll give you the names of every stay-behind agent from Cairo to Oran. Von Stauffenberg considered the word she had used. She felt that she was deep enough in to use the word that the SA had chosen for their genuine signals, which had been so brutally betrayed by her own hand, and turned over to the Abwehr and used with vicious effect with the SA in Britain handling radio traffic. There was a letter sent to him that very morning with such a word transcribed, although few people would know it. A backbone line with smaller lines at different angles and positions, to all the world looking like decoration around the bottom left corner and top right corner of the letter. He could not read Ogham, but O'Reilly could. As could Swallow. Von Stauffenberg signed the authorization with his remaining hand. He didn't tell her that he found her pro-Nazi zeal viscerally repulsive, or that he was watching her move like a piece on Dudley Clark's invisible board. He let her believe she was the predator. The shipment will be authorized, he said. But if you fail to deliver the radio codes for the remaining French networks, Mademoiselle Mansour, you will find that the Reich is very unforgiving to those who waste its steel. As Eve walked out of the Bendler block, she tucked the paper into her glove. She had the guns. She had betrayed her former comrades. And most importantly, she had confirmed through the Abwehr files that Josephine O'Neill, the woman she thought dead in Leipzig, was not only alive but was currently limping back into the very trap Eve had already baited with the blood of 31 men. And so, to the Mediterranean, for her part of the bargain, to cause wretched chaos and sabotage with the enemy. But first, Geneva, to the sanctuary she was building for two. David was upholding his end of the bargain, by remaining exactly where he was. 88,888,888, 5th of June 1944. The day of the big one had finally arrived, a 24-hour delay caused by the dark, cumulonimbus clouds accumulating into blankets encompassing the whole sky. The air was thick with the scent of wet pine and high-octane fuel. The deception was complete. In Kent, Dudley Clark's inflatable tanks sat in silent, rubbery rows, and his wooden hay bale tanks extricated genuineness, mocking the German aerial scouts. But, in the fertile, rich country of Wessex, near Ferndown, in Dorset, Paddy Mayne stood on the tarmac, the weight of his parachute and combat gear making him look like a titan of ancient Greek mythology. They were headed 30 miles into the French interior to clear the way for the D-Day troops, a butcher's task. He looked toward the Red Cross lorry idling near the gates, its headlights hooded. He knew his sister was behind the wheel, the logistics officer that she had been for the last 5 months, from her bed in early January, growing her role in Stirling to surrounding villages and towns in Perthshire, until she had become part of the ICRC for Great Britain. Off the south coast, while the big one was being carried out, her Red Cross contingent was heading from Poole to Falmouth, and then on to Lisbon, to make its way around the North Mediterranean coast until shipping to Geneva. Men would get something to soothe them in their incarceration, and Josephine would get her opportunity. Not that anyone knew it, for she had played her part impeccably. Josephine watched the planes warm up, the roar of the engines vibrating in her chest, right where the ache of her loss still lingered. She wasn't a mother, and she was no longer merely a sister, she was a survivor of the Vosges going home to settle the score. Menzies can forbid the rescue of a Sterling, she murmured, shifting the lorry into gear, but he can't forbid the memory of 31 men. Once the SAS were airborne, she turned the lorry to Poole. A Major Johnson had taken the initiative to get the vehicles to the dock, and Josephine yielded her lorry to one of his captains. As expected, she was to make her way to Salisbury, and then by train to London, and then back to Edinburgh, and the Bridge of Allen, and then, Gear House. In fact, Josephine had promised Bill Sterling, and she would. Just not yet. At Ferndown, she found the hangar where Druce, Barkworth, Franks and the Prince were waiting for her. Yuri Galitzine took her hand and kissed the back of it. They too were parachuting, but not over Normandy. 88,888,888. 4 hours later, Josephine stood in the aperture of a modified bomber, the freezing wind howling past the fuselage. Under her uniform, a French peasant blouse and sturdy wool skirt. At least when she landed, if she avoided the trees and did not strangle herself or break her back, she could pull over the disguise. Action front. The dispatcher yelled. It was Bruce, who had escaped in a Red Cross parcel from Colditz. If only he had known the laughable, outrageous action she was carrying out, and had carried out, that would get to Colditz within the parcel at about the time she planned to be there. Josephine refused to look at her comrades, though Henry Druce was a hand away, and instead, stepped into the void. The opening shock was a violent, upward jerk that snapped the harness straps directly against her lower abdomen. For a heartbeat, she saw a white blinding flare of agony as her scar pulled while she plummeted, and Josephine gasped, her scream lost in the slipstream. She drifted down through the dark, the scent of delicate alpine flowers and berries beginning to ripen rose to meet her, like a macabre embrace. Thankfully, there were no trees to impede her fall, and Josephine rolled against a hard ridge of moss and bracken. She would be bruised, but that would be all. Burying her parachute, she used the compass in the back of one of her tunic buttons to establish where she was, and looked up for a moment to see 1 or 2 thistledown parachutists landing about a mile away. Josephine lay in the damp grass, trembling, the bitter sharpness of the benzedrine amphetamine on her tongue. She needed to be awake all night for this. They were to meet at the priest's house in Moussy. She watched the moon rise and determined where north was. While the Allied fleet was currently hitting the beaches of Normandy, the feint the Germans believed while focusing on Calais, the SAS and the SO were no longer bound by instruction. Now, she whispered to herself, and got to her feet. In the darkness, her civilian clothes hid her uniform, and she adjusted her civilian shawl to hide the Sten submachine gun slung over her shoulder and under her armpit. She wasn't just here to coordinate the Maquis with Abbe Gassman. She was here because the Red Cross parcels she had spent months packing were already sitting in the storerooms of Colditz and the guardrooms of Natzweiler. She knew the routes, she knew the special items she'd hidden, and she knew that while the world looked at Normandy, she was the one who held the keys to the back door of the Reich. When she had got to Galitzine and Druce, and Barkworth and Franks, and a plan had been formulated to go east, only then would Josephine tell them. 88,888,888. The air in the Oflag Fosse courtyard was thin and biting, smelling of damp stone and the cheap ersatz tobacco David Sterling had spent the morning trading. He didn't stand with the other prominenti near the chapel, leaning against the soot-stained wall of the salehouse, watching the world through the narrowed eyes of a man who owned the shadows. David had decided to run Colditz. Maneuvering himself into the role of the camp's unofficial quartermaster, he had schmoozed his way into controlling a black market that spanned from the boiler rooms to the guardhouse. For a few bars of Red Cross chocolate and a handful of English cigarettes, he could procure anything from a German corporal's passbook to a bottle of schnapps. However, the stoic brotherhood of the cold, its escape spirit did not extend to him. The other officers, men who knew how he had treated Josephine, in her role as Ethan O'Neill, a double agent with the prime objective of getting him out, mainly, amongst other things, that he had been so cavalier about her efforts of breaking him out. How would he be with them? He was a major, and for most of them, their superior. But, as Reed and Howe had commented bitterly, if he could not extend his humility towards a woman who had spent her entire efforts in getting him out, and allowed himself to get recaptured so casually, their respect was due, but cautious. He was invited sparingly to meetings or to appear before the escape committee, and never at crucial moments. In short, if he could do that to someone to help him, what might he do to them? Admittedly, he was excellent at procuring the supplies they needed, and had earned the nickname of the merchant. However, they disapproved of his bragging, loud-mouthing his desert exploits in the mess hall as if the war were a private game he'd invented. "We're cutting a tunnel under the theater, Sterling," the escape committee via Pat Reed had told him flatly the week before. "And you're out of it. You're too loud, too tall, and you bring too much heat. Stick to your tins of Klim." The rejection burned. So he continued with his redistribution of the Red Cross parcels, his restless, arrogant fury driving him on. Sterling had decided to prove them wrong. While he had been unsuccessful with his acquisitions in the past, he had a new plan. Chisel, wire cutters and guard uniform to hand, he had made it as far as the outer wall near the terrace that night, knowing a French push was underway. He was halfway through the wire, the chisel biting into mortar, when the beam of a searchlight swept over him, over the roof, down the French block, and through the well. The escape had looked good. However, Sterling hadn't even reached the Mulder River before a torchlight was shone in his face. The uniform, tailored from a dyed blanket, looked poor under the accusatory glare of the electric bulb. As the guards dragged him back through the courtyard, the other prisoners watched from the darkened windows. There was no sympathy in their silence, only the grim satisfaction of seeing the great phantom tripped up by his own hubris. David Sterling moped that evening, and took himself up to the chapel loft, knowing he had lost fellowship with his peers. Be kinder. Do something. Get yourself out and show that Josephine's and Paddy's efforts were not in vain. As he climbed the steps, he heard a static hiss. Racing up the last few, he saw the lights on the radio that he believed to be defunct since the last time they had used it. Beside it, the genius of manufacture, Charles Collins. The lieutenant turned and saw David Sterling, stepping away from the radio and folding his arms. Suddenly, a voice, as he remembered last October, came over the airwaves, just briefly, and died. Is Milo still transmitting? Sterling snapped, barely looking at the receiver. What did they say? He added, his voice was cautious, sensing the shift in the air. Collins wasn't listening to caution anymore, and folded his arms tighter. But Sterling wasn't about to use Collins as a middleman. Instead, he knelt by the radio receiver and moved the dial. Milo, Sterling intoned, demanding a reply. He raised a hand threateningly when Collins made to intervene. Milo, this is 4C, are you reading me? Over. Ronald Douglas, came the reply. Sterling crouched lower, his mind strategizing over the possibility. Ethan has told me all about this, Ronald Douglas. Every little detail. Swallow, came the crackly reply. And Sterling's heart sank. He stepped away from the radio, and sat on the top step of the chapel's loft as the pieces clicked into place. Why are you still involved? A broken bar, Major Sterling. Collins's voice was low, and reverberated around the stone loft. He saw Sterling's twisted, agonized features and added, with respect, he repeated, you had your chance, a chance so many here want to take. But David Sterling did not wait. As the pieces clicked into place, the betrayal felt like a physical blow. He hurried back down the steps and across to the steps that took him up to the officers' dorm. The guard he was bribing with tobacco stood aside and even held the door as Sterling stormed through. So, she was still in communication with the Irish rebels via Douglas, the Scottish advocate of independence. She had never stopped. A cold, Hard certainty settled over him, fueled by a mounting rage. It was all a setup. Every sacrifice she'd made, every risk she'd taken, it wasn't for him. It was for William Joyce. It was all a calculated play to funnel help to the resistance against the British. Of course, he spat, a bitter, mocking laugh escaping him. Of course. That's why she was so desperate to get me out. It wasn't love. It wasn't loyalty. It was a cover. He sat on his bunk, then flung a glass bottle that once contained M&B bitter across the dorm, where it smashed against the door frame, making the corporal who was just coming through from the lower ranks dorms duck, and pull the door closed again. Sterling slammed a fist against the table, the wood groaning under the impact. He felt like a fool, a marksman who had missed the most obvious target. He had been a pawn in her political endgame, and yet a broken bar. A broken bar and yet a broken bar. A broken bar. His mind betrayed him as he saw her face again. Not the mask of a rebel, but the woman he'd held. He'd seen the look in her eyes in the quiet hours when there was no one left to perform for. That couldn't have been scripted. Could it? I saw her eyes when I was fucking her. No one could be that goddamn good, Sterling whispered, his anger now warring with a desperate, agonizing doubt within himself. She was a damn Irish Republican. But God, when he had taken here a broken bar, his heart a broken bar, his soul a broken bar, knew that what she had given him was not part of the game. 88,888,888. Now, sitting in the damp chill of the solitary cell, David leaned his head against the freezing stone. His hands were raw, the knuckles split from the wire. No one stopped him. Even Eggers now held him in grudging respect. Apart from being on the outside of the castle, there was little he was stopped from doing, such was his influence within the widespread trade network. His thoughts drifted first to Eve Mansour. He knew she was alive, the black market grapevine was a two-way street, and a German guard had let slip that a French Algerian beauty was seen in the company of the Abwehr in Berlin. The thought of her was a fever. He hated her for her betrayal, yet he hungered for her ruthlessness. She was the only woman who spoke his language of blood and maps. But as the night deepened, it was the thought of Josephine that truly stoked the fire in his gut. Eve was a mirror, but Josephine was a challenge. She was the only person who had ever looked at him and refused to blink. She never backed down, never yielded to his grand designs, and her defiance sat in his mind like a burr under a saddle. It annoyed him to the point of obsession, a psychological itch that had long ago transmuted into a dark, predatory lust. He imagined her now, likely limping through some frozen French forest, still stubborn, still breathing. He didn't want to comfort her, he wanted to break that defiance. He visualized their next meeting with a punishing clarity, how he would pin her against a wall, ignoring her protests, and take her with a rough, possessive finality that would finally force her to acknowledge who owned the ground she stood on. The thought of physically overwhelming the rebel woman who dared to stand up to him, turned him on more than Eve's practiced seductions ever could. Soon, Josephine Joyce, he rasped, his breath misting in the cell. Next time, you won't have the last word. He closed his eyes, the cold of the cell forgotten as he planned his next escape, turning his mind to the deals to be done before a bell in the morning and what goods that would bring into his control. 88,888,888. A patrol of the Seacoast intercepted them near a mountain pass. Fed by gasmen and allowed to stay in the tiny church, it had been Galizing who had advocated pushing east in the darkness. However, this had not gone well. Isselhorst had implemented a no-mercy policy called Walled Fist, Party in the Forest. The fun, needless to say, was to be had by the Germans. In the chaos of the skirmish, Josephine was separated, driven toward a secondary checkpoint where the face of the Reich awaited her, not a common soldier, but a ghost of the Berlin high circles. It was Muller, a man who had moved in the same orbit as Heydrich before the latter's assassination. He looked at Josephine, not with the suspicion of a captor, but with the twisted recognition of a handler. The little Irish swallow, Muller purred, his gloved hand tilting her chin upward. "We heard you had perished in the English bombings. Why are you dressed like a common saboteur? Berlin has been wondering when you would return to provide the final reports on the Sterling brothers." He still believed she was theirs, a deep cover asset whose silence had been misinterpreted as a loss. Josephine, her heart hammered against her ribs, felt the cold weight of the deception. She didn't fight, she leaned into the lie. "The British are suspicious, Commandant Muller," she whispered, her voice a brittle rasp. "I had to come this way. I have intelligence that the big one in the north is a feint. I need to get to Berlin. I need to see my brother William." And Parade Galitzin's determination and ingenuity would gain them the advantage they needed. Perhaps 4 men could sabotage and not be discovered. Moosey remembered and would shield them, for that they had done before. Josephine was certain, and a tiny flicker of regret sat in her stomach. She had lost the people she loved, who knew everything she had been through, and all she had done for them, for the Vosges drop. And Muller would take Josephine to Berlin as the Abwehr would expect, yet where she really needed to go was across the Rhine. Bags had been abandoned in Moosey, so at least Druce and Barkworth would be able to use the radio. Not that she would be able to carry them far herself. Josephine she would have to cut and run when she could. She would need a reason to be in Colditz, whether William trusted her or not, and the chances were not, considering her action in Leipzig. He may choose to believe her, or pretend to, but his word was all. Josephine stared out into the woodland. Her friends had faded into the tree line toward Natzweiler. She had been left with the silence of the forest. She would be with them, but the call of Colditz sounded more intensely and more deeply than the Vosges plan, and Josephine felt terrible that the noble cause Galitzin had been working towards over the months meant so little to her.